You're Locked On NHL, your daily podcast on the National Hockey League. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
It's time now for our bi-weekly women's hockey spotlight. So we welcome in Erica L. Ayala. And Erica, lots going on right now, including the PWHL final now in our sights.
That's right. We have one team that has already punched their ticket. That is PWHL Boston. And we talked about Toronto being that they had the top seed. They were able to pick their opponent, but their opponent has taken them to game 5. So we'll get into that. But Rachel, I figure we'll get the Boston advancing out of the way since it seems to be a sore spot for you.
Listen. All 3 games go to overtime, the middle of which goes to a triple overtime. Like, heart is breaking for Montreal at the moment. They just could not get it done.
Yeah, it was, tough to see Montreal. They started, changing up their lines, which was also interesting to see that we saw Michaela Grant-Mentis at one point on that top line with Marie-Philippe Poulin. And that alone is kind of a story for Montreal because, Ottawa let go of Bucky, as she's known, Michaela Grant-Mentis. And then you find her on the top line with arguably for some and for some not arguably at all the best women's hockey player, certainly for right now, but to your point, Montreal just they couldn't get past Boston. I think it turned out that Boston really was able to turn things up in the postseason, and that's what happens when you just get to the postseason. You have players like Amanda Pelkey. She's one of, I guess, 5 players with 3 points in the playoffs. Her breakdown is 2 goals and an assist. Tapani, who came over actually from Minnesota, also making an impact. And so, good on Boston. We have been critical of some of their stars, including, of course, Hillary Knight getting started a little bit slow, but Boston now in a position where they have a chance to compete for the first ever PWHL championship.
And I think it's good for women's hockey to have 3 overtime playoff games, including multiple overtimes in one of them. I think it's just a great showcase for the sport and for the league.
Well, I mean, again, we knew that this was going to be a pretty heavy competition. And I think what you're seeing now is perhaps, if there was any breaking in that was happening for some of these elite level international players, once you get to there's a trophy on the line, we're seeing that things are really ramping up. To your point, there's been multiple overtimes. There's really been no blowouts, with exception perhaps of that game against Minnesota and Toronto, which we'll talk about in a little bit, but not surprised to see what we're seeing at all, because this is what the PWHL said they wanted, right? The best competing against each other in one central league. And so, yeah, fireworks. I also thought it was interesting. I was having a conversation with someone from the PWHL, actually, and they were traveling back to the East Coast from Minnesota after the last game. And I did not realize that, at least in Montreal, when you go into overtime, they can still serve alcohol during overtime. And so that's very different than anything I've ever experienced in the States, where you go to a concert and a performer is late, or, a game goes into OT and you're wanting a little more, beer or whatever. They can't get it. Hopefully you planned ahead.
Yeah.
Oh man, I just thought that was funny. But let's go to the other series, because again, Toronto coming in as the top seed. They did get that early win against Minnesota. One of 4, I believe, shutouts in the playoffs, and it was a 4-1 rout by I almost said the Toronto 6. Wow. PWHL Toronto. And other than that, it's been back and forth. They also shut out Minnesota in game 2. But then Minnesota has been able to really come roaring back here. They get a shutout 2-0 over Toronto in game 3 on May 13th, and then get a very tightly contested double overtime win against Toronto in game 4 in Minnesota to force game 5, which will be later on today. I mean, again, you pick your opponent, and I'm thinking maybe after dropping those 2 games, after knowing they got pulled out of the or handpicked by Toronto, PWHL Minnesota, Gil was ready to play.
No doubt about it. Now, question, do you think Boston has a preference as to who they face in the final?
Yeah, that's an interesting question indeed. I think Minnesota's a scrappy team. I wouldn't want to necessarily underestimate them. I think also you have to take into consideration that unfortunately for Toronto, they lost their top scorer in
Yeah.
Natalie Spooner, who we've talked a lot about in the women's hockey spotlight in the last handful of episodes. So I mean, maybe if you want to take your chances, you go and see if Toronto can get through, just because, again, one of the top scorers in the league, and certainly their top scorer, is out. They listed her as long-term injury reserve. So that means it's unlikely that we'll see her for the remainder of the playoffs.
The PWHL Awards, talk to me about that. Where are we at with that?
Yeah, so we already have the PWHL announcing a few of the finalists for their awards. We have the Rookie of the Year, Emma Malte, Alina Mueller, and Grace Zumwinkle. Now, of course, this is the inaugural season of the league, so true rookies are considered those who have who are playing in their first professional league. And we also see that we have the Coach of the Year finalists in Corey Chevery, who just lost to head coach of PWHL Boston, Courtney Kessel, and Troy Ryan of PWHL Toronto. And also we have Forward of the Year, Alex Carpenter from PWHL New York, who we'll talk about in a little bit. Marie-Philippe Poulin just talked about, and of course, Natalie Spooner, who we also talked about. I would be surprised personally if it's not Spooner that wins that. Again, we just talked about what Spooner has meant. I do think, though, that Marie-Philippe Poulin is likely to pull a decent amount of votes and maybe even get it, but I would give it to Spooner if I was voting. But that kind of takes me to a conversation that, as a member and the chair of the women's hockey chapter of the Professional Hockey Writers Association, that we wanted to have, because we saw that some of the voters for this award did not include outlets like the Ice Garden, outlets like the Victory Press, or even the Hockey News and their women's hockey vertical. And that to me was extremely surprising. We we know that these outlets have been covering women's hockey since there was the original NWHL. Some of them have gone through the ups and downs of what we've seen in women's professional hockey. And I can report that, as part of the Professional Hockey Writers Association, we have had meetings with the league where we expressed that, where we said that, this is a little bit it's a little bit disheartening to see that more, what I would say, independent, and that meaning non-mainstream media, outlets that are running independently of any major funding source, that they were not involved. And that being said, I thought it was also interesting that and not that we don't see this, but usually in other leagues that I cover, when they have awards, they'll, or specifically classifications like, the top 5 players in the league, your first team kind of awards. Sometimes we do see head coaches and or GMs vote for those awards, but traditionally in sports, what we see, Rachel and Gil, is that for individual awards, a lot of times those awards are voted by media members, and if there's multiple voting, even fan voting at sometimes, those are separated. But we see that all of the coaches and general managers also included on this list. They also have some retired players like Megan Duggan, which, great to get them involved, but not something that we generally see. So I think a lot of people were just a little bit curious as to how the awards were kind of divvied out and why some, again, smaller, what I would call independent outlets were not included.
Yeah, it is really disheartening in a lot of ways, just because I know those outlets and the writers there have been covering the game for so long, and they have the context and the history and the knowledge to really understand what the performances this season mean in the context of their careers and all of that. So and the coverage goes back even before the NWHL to the CWHL
Exactly.
and such. So
Right.
hopefully they'll rectify that in the future.
Yeah, and again, we have had difficulties as the women's hockey chapter getting consistent meetings with the league, but we hope that that's something that will start in the off season. And this was one of the things, and we put out a statement, and part of the reason that we put out the statement was because this kind of was one of the things that we felt was, it just kind of spoke to, all right, we really want to get more involved here, and there are more writers that are deserving, and there are more things that the league, we hope, will consider as we continue to forge a relationship. So just to wrap up awards, I mentioned Rookie of the Year finalists were announced, Coach of the Year, Forward of the Year. We're expecting on Tuesday, May 21st to get Defender of the Year. Also, I love that they say defender, not defenseman. Love that. On Tuesday, May 21st, Wednesday, May 22nd, Goaltender of the Year, and then Thursday, May 23rd, the Billie Jean King MVP Award. We talked about award names also. I think, Billie Jean King, for a lot of people, is a very prominent figure in women's sports, and understandably so, and never played hockey. So, that's very interesting. There's so many legends of women's hockey that were right there to name an award after. But, kind of similarly, I guess, to the award for the champion, they kept it in-house. So, a little bit of a branding thing there, perhaps. But anyway, one team that will certainly not be competing for the championship this year is PWHL New York. But by way of, and we talked about this on the last segment, by way of being able to win the most games since their elimination, although they were really the only team that was in contention this year anyway, they do get the number 1 overall pick. But they will have that pick under a new head coach, as head coach, Howie Draper had mutually agreed to part ways and vacate that position. He will remain, though, Rachel, with PWHL New York in kind of a senior advisory role in, of all things, scouting. So,
Right.
On the one hand, I don't know that if someone was unsuccessful in kind of putting a team together, that they are maybe the best gauge of talent. And I've talked about, honestly, it was a little surprising for Howie and Pascal Daou, who is their general manager, to multiple times say that they didn't see any film on the players that were actively on their roster. So that's a little concerning. But I think also some people are seeing this as maybe it's like one of those like emeritus roles where it's a title, but maybe it doesn't really have any teeth.
Or maybe he's under contract, so we might as well keep him in the organization and get something out of the contract.
Yeah, I mean, all of the above are possible. But we did get to hear from Pascal Daou. I have been very vocal that there is a great head coach on the PWHL coaching staff who has familiarity with women's hockey, who has familiarity with a very short women's hockey season, and has yielded results almost immediately. And that, of course, is Colton Orr, who also coached in the catchment area of PWHL New York, which of course includes New Jersey, Long Island, and Connecticut. And so I would love to see Colton Orr really get a shot. Pascal Daou said that they will consider everyone. They're going to cast a wide net. He also did say, though, that the head coach, he's expecting that she or he will be able to have an input on their coaching staff. So not only are we going to get a new head coach, Rachel, but it's possible that we could also see some assistants relocate or change roles. What are your thoughts on what PWHL New York needs as far as a head coach?
I think they need a coach who understands their players and how to use them properly. I think that's the biggest issue with this team, and how to put a lineup together that can work together well. And I think needs to be more involved in creating the roster for this team the next year, and really just having it be a team effort with the GM and working together to figure out the right strategy and figuring out that system that'll work with the players they have.
Yeah, indeed. And we also heard from Pascal that they are expecting to have that coach and hoping to have the coach sit at the draft table, as he said, when the draft is in Minnesota. That being said, they don't want to rush the process. I also asked Pascal if player feedback and input regarding the coach had any indication and bearing on the decision to mutually part ways with Howie, to which he said, of course, they hold exit interviews, but it wasn't necessarily something specific coming from the players. I was dealing with that this offseason with the Seattle Kraken, and reports from national writers that was perhaps the case, while Seattle Kraken players were saying that wasn't. I'm curious to see. I don't know if we'll ever know for sure, but again, there had been reports in PWHL New York that PWHL New York players were a little bit more active in kind of aligning their their different line mates and things of that nature, which could indicate that Howie Draper really didn't have or didn't take ownership of the lineup and the roster. So I think it's going to be curious to see. I think it will be in the best interest of PWHL New York, Gil, to name that head coach before they go into the draft, because one of the players that they were unable to sign, and more so perhaps due to visa classifications, is Claire Thompson, who will be in the draft and who General Manager Pascal Daou said is, of course, still one of their targets. But you would imagine whether it's Claire Thompson or some of the other top choices that some of the draft picks, they might not necessarily have a choice, but also in free agency, you want players to know who they're playing for, especially for a team that struggled mightily like PWHL New York, Gil.
For sure. And you want to be able to select players in the draft who fit the system that your coach wants to run. So, it works both ways, and you really do need to have someone in place as soon as possible to scout those players, choose those players, pick a direction, and then go with it.
Well, I suppose we will see how it all shakes out. But again, we have Game 5 against Toronto and Minnesota tonight. We will see who gets to advance and take on PWHL Boston for the inaugural PWHL Championship. Of course, once we have a winner, we will come back here on the Women's Hockey Spotlight to talk about